Today the river runs freely through the picturesque Green Valley, but if you look closely, the scars of the battle that was fought here over 60 years ago are still visible. Andrew Salmon, author of To the Last Stand, takes up the story.
The two bloodiest battles fought by British soldiers since World War II were Imjin River and this one, Happy Valley, and they're both fought by the same units. 157 Royal Ulster Rifles were killed here. I think about 22 or 23 Royal Northumberland Fusiliers were killed in the next valley along, all in one night. They're halting the Chinese attack, this human wave attack on Seoul on the night of January the 3rd, 1951. And of course it's still remembered today because the stand made in this valley by the Royal Ulster Rifles and stand made in the adjacent valley by the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers allowed countless hundreds, probably thousands of refugees in Seoul to escape across the freezing Han River and away from the communists, and Seoul fell the following.
The scene changes to Liverpool, where the Royal Ulster Rifles have embarked for Korea. In spite of the swift victory, there would surely be work for this famous regiment out there, as Mr. Strachey pointed out.
Whatever task you're called upon to carry out, it will be an important task, important for the future of the peace of the world.
May we echo the War Secretary's good wishes to these British reinforcements. And of course that goes for the Gloucesters too, who left Southampton for Korea aboard the Empire Windrush. There was a lucky last-minute break for one of them, reservist bandsman Wagstaff, who was released from the draft just before the ship sailed. For the rest, it was goodbye and a safe return as soon as possible. And so say all of us. First pictures of the reoccupation of Seoul by South Koreans show Marines of the Republic engaged in street actions. Following the brilliant work of the American Marine Advance Guards, these troops were mopping up stragglers, interrogating and searching North Koreans throughout the city. The capture of Seoul had been a tough job, and it was inevitable that many civilian casualties should occur in the process. Some estimates indeed have put them at over 20,000. Resistance had been strong, and every street had been defended by the enemy. The taking of Seoul, however, transformed the whole Korean situation at a stroke.
Here, in April 1951, Commonwealth troops managed to hold off the Chinese advance. That effort prevented the capture of Seoul. The Korean War was the first fought by the United Nations. 21 countries took part, 16 in the combat. It proved the biggest test of the UN since its inception in 1945.
It wasn't just an effort on the part of the Commonwealth, of course. It was the first United Nations action against aggression.
In the valley where that bloody battle was fought, Irish and Korean veterans, joined by members of Two Royal Irish, gathered to remember the sacrifice of their antecedent battalion 62 years later.
And in the morning, we will remember them. It was a bit quieter today than it was when I was here before. Very funny at first, you felt a bit, actually I don't really know how I felt, but I look forward to it. I've been looking forward to it for a good while. And I can't wait till Friday, I think it is, we're going to the graves, so I've got camera there. I'm going to take as many photographs as I can.
And it's at the UN Memorial Cemetery in Busan where the dead of 16 nations are remembered. And this is the cemetery where the 157 members of the Royal Ulster Rifles who were killed in one night during the Battle of Happy Valley are buried. For the veterans, it was a time to remember the friends and colleagues who didn't come home, and the commanding officer of Two Royal Irish laid a wreath at the Wall of Remembrance where the names of each and every soldier who lost their lives during the Battle of Happy Valley are inscribed. Fiona Weir, Forces News, South Korea.
On April 22, 1955, British Lieutenants Philip Curtis and Terry Waters attended church service in an abandoned Korean temple in the windy hills of South Korea. The two men pondered silently as they prepared themselves for the battle ahead. Their regiment had been appointed to hold the line at the Imjin River at any cost, and they knew that if the front was breached, Seoul would fall again. That night, hundreds of brave British and Belgian soldiers held their positions along the hills on the south riverbank, when suddenly a flare lit up the sky and revealed thousands of Chinese soldiers crossing the river in a massive, abrupt attack. The men would soon be engulfed in one of the bloodiest battles in British military history. Outnumbered 7-1, the British soldiers and their allies tried to hold off a massive wave of Chinese soldiers that threw themselves against the UN line of defense in an attempt to breach it. It would be China's last and largest effort to try and overwhelm the weary and numerically inferior UN task force and invade the Korean peninsula to establish a communist government. But the battle-hardened Gloucestershire Regiment would not give up so easily. The conflict. The war in Korea was reaching a boiling point. What started as a struggle between communist North Korea and democratic South Korea had evolved into a violent proxy war involving China, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and a dozen UN countries. By 1950, China had entered the conflict, and it had conquered practically all the peninsula and cornered the UN troops in the port city of Busan. However, after finally receiving the reinforcements they so desperately needed, the UN forces were able to counterattack and break the siege of Busan. The UN task force then took Seoul and pushed the Chinese and North Korean troops back through the 38th parallel north. Still, the victory was short-lived, as a massive Chinese counteroffensive soon pushed back and captured the southern capital once more. With additional reinforcements and superior air support, UN forces managed to take back the city in March of 1951, making it the fourth time the capital had been conquered in the last 2 years. The war continued, with the battlefront moving up and down the 38th parallel as both factions made gains and suffered losses. Winter cleared, and UN forces dug in, holding defensive positions close to the 38th parallel. Eventually, the 29th British Independent Infantry Brigade Group was ordered to hold a line by the Imjin River, just 20 miles off Seoul, as the Chinese and North Korean troops were expected to unleash a major attack. It was spring, and the Chinese prepared for their largest and most ambitious offensive yet. They planned to capture Seoul once again, and then break the UN's line of defense to capture the south and force the UN forces to retreat. Clashing forces. The entire Korean conflict was defined as an encounter between overwhelming numbers against advanced firepower, with North Korea having an almost unlimited number of Chinese troops at its disposal. Consequently, their strategy was to overpower the UN forces by sheer numbers alone, and hope that the opposition's technologically advanced weapons and intelligence would not be enough to withstand their assault. For the attack on Imjin River, the Chinese offensive was commanded by General Peng Dehuai and consisted of 300,000 troops over a 40-mile front, while British troops defending the hill on the southern riverbank would face 3 divisions led by General Yang Deji's 19th Army. On the other hand, British forces were made up by the 29th British Independent Infantry Brigade Group, commanded by Brigadier Tom Brodie. The brigade was composed of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Carn, and the 1st Battalion, the Royal Ulster Rifles, and their attached Belgian battalion. Support for the British forces included a tank unit of 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, 25-pound guns from the 45th Field Regiment Royal Artillery, and 4.2-inch mortars from the 170th Independent Mortar Battery. The positioning of the 29th Brigade's battalions was weak and thinly spread across several hills. The size of the area was more suited to a division than a brigade, but at the moment, the defense had been deemed a temporary line, so the positions were neither mined, nor wired, nor adequately reinforced. The British battalions were situated on a hilltop south of the Imjin River, while the Belgian battalion was north of the river on Hill 196. The groups were broadly scattered and incapable of providing mutual support, while communication was also an issue due to the distance and insufficient defensive groups. In addition, the 8th Hussars tanks and the 45th Field Regiment's guns were located further south to support the troops. However, the battalions had no medium or heavy artillery support accessible at battle time. The assault. The attack came on the night of April 22nd, when Chinese infantry strode across the Imjin River covered in utter darkness. In the deepest point, the water covered the invading soldiers all the way to their torsos. Their daunting numbers were revealed when the UN troops fired flares over the water. The pale light showed countless bodies crossing the Imjin's waters in coordinated silence. The British soldiers began to fire at once to repel the Chinese troops, and their fire was highly successful at shedding through the incoming multitude, inflicting countless casualties on the enemy forces. Still, little by little, many Chinese soldiers were able to cross and bring the fight directly to the hills where the British troops were positioned. Due to previous intelligence efforts, Chinese commanders knew the disposition of the 29th Brigade and the gaps between their units, and they used this information to encircle and isolate the defending battalions. On the left side, the Gloucestershire Regiment soon became a primary target for the Chinese, and their positions were gradually overwhelmed. On the east side, the Northumberland Fusiliers also became heavily engaged. Both battalions were unable to help each other as they were separated by the heights of Gamak San, the highest hill in the area. By the early morning on April 23rd, the Gloucestershire Regiment, also known as simply the Gloucesters, were being forced into an ever-shrinking perimeter on Hill 235, while a company of the Fusiliers was overrun on its hilltop. Lieutenant Curtis and his platoon were then ordered to carry out a counterattack to capture some of the positions that had been lost to the overwhelming Chinese numbers. Their counteroffensive was initially effective, but ultimately was held up by heavy Chinese fire and grenades. The lieutenant then instructed some of his men to give covering fire and charge the central position of resistance. During his attack, Curtis was severely wounded, but he insisted on making a second attempt to capture the lost positions. During the second assault, Curtis lost his life within a few yards of his objective, not before throwing a grenade that destroyed the enemy position he had so bravely tried to regain. He would be awarded a Victoria Cross for his sacrifice. Throughout the night, the surrounded infantry units received support from the guns of the 45th Field Regiment. Then, as dawn broke, Chinese forces achieved a breakthrough and forced several UN troops to withdraw south. Centurion tanks from the 8th Hussars now moved up the valley to support the weakened infantry and evacuate their wounded, while UN airstrikes arrived with the light of day, bringing some relief to the heavily outnumbered ground troops in the area. The Gloucesters. The brief pause in the Chinese offensive allowed the Royal Ulster Rifles to move ahead and occupy Hill 398 to secure the only position where the brigade could hope to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Belgian battalion battled its way back across the river and redeployed to the south. During the night of April 23rd, Chinese reinforcements crossed the Imjin with the intent of eliminating the Gloucesters, who continued to resist wave after wave of Chinese attacks. The fighting continued, with more casualties and wounded soldiers by the minute. The Gloucesters were becoming a significant concern for UN officials, as their position was compromised and they were running low on ammunition. Still, they held their position, even as other UN units retreated, due to the overpowering numbers of the Chinese. On April 24th, an effort was made to reinforce the Gloucesters, but it proved a disaster. The Chinese now completely surrounded Hill 235, and it was unreachable by the Allies. By now, the entire Chinese 63rd Corps had successfully crossed the river and threatened to entrap the other isolated battalions. Astonishingly, the Gloucesters and Ulster riflemen clung on, repelling attack after attack, even calling for airstrikes on their positions, when the assaults became exceedingly overwhelming. After 2 days of relentless fighting, the order was given to withdraw, and the weakened and depleted battalions fled across Route 11, which was under enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Fusiliers escaped under the covering fire of the tanks, and many of the Ulster riflemen marched southeast over the hills, avoiding the valley floor that was now overrun by enemy forces. The withdrawal was slow and uncoordinated, and the tanks had to be used to retrieve many of the wounded soldiers. Then, as the Chinese realized the UN forces were retreating, they rushed down from the hills to intercept them and prevent them from escaping. The Chinese inflicted numerous casualties in the retreating UN forces, but they could not stop the withdrawal. By now, only the Gloucesters remained put, unable to escape. With no way to go, they were given permission to break out, but most were captured and taken as prisoners of war. Lieutenant Terry Waters became a prisoner of war after being captured with many other Gloucester members. They were tortured and forced to starve before tempting them with much better conditions if they revealed details of the UN's forces. Most, including Waters, refused. The lieutenant would pass away in prison and would later receive a George Cross for his sacrifice. Although they withdrew at the end of the battle, the 29th British Independent Infantry Brigade held the line for enough time for reinforcements to arrive. The Chinese then sent all the troops they could to overwhelm the UN's defenses, but they could never break the line. The brigade had lost over a quarter of its strength, suffering 1,091 casualties, including 622 Gloucesters. Chinese losses were estimated at 70,000. The 29th Brigade's heroic stand at the Imjin River was crucial in the outcome of the war. By the time they retreated, They had bought sufficient time for the UN forces to regroup and block the Chinese advance in Seoul. The encounter also brought the conflict to a stalemate, successfully blocking China from making any further territorial gains. China and North Korea would sign an armistice only a few months later, and that truce has kept peace in the peninsula to this day.